basic pre-exam announcement, same protocol as before. There'll be, rather than have 3, which is a little cumbersome, there are just 2, basically the same exam, just 2. So we can basically, and so you always have to be sitting next to somebody who doesn't have the same exam. That's it. The usual protocol follows. I'll try to be in here. Typically, I get in here about 20 of, I would say, so a quarter of, no later than that. If you want to come in and start early, well, that's good. I don't think it will take that long. So everything is about the same. Please bring pencils. Nothing more aggravating. I have a limited supply here of pencils or pencil-like items that may or may not work, but it's okay. Very limited supply. So if all you have is a pen, don't use it. It drives me more crazy than that. But so much for pet peeves. So everything else is the same. Again, shoot any questions you want my way. Busy today, but I mean, anytime I get them, eventually I'll get back. If not, no later than tomorrow morning. So we're good. We're certainly going to, I think we will finish all of this part, really the complexity of what's going on, the events that basically make these individual muscle fibers contract. I think that's what you're going to see today more than anything. And we'll sort of start where we left off with excitation, contraction, coupling. I'll go over that same video again, and then we'll get to the cross bridge cycle. There's a lot of detail when we get there about the role of ATP. We're going to simplify it in the sense that you're going to see that we have to, once a muscle contracts, we have to put energy into it to allow it to relax. That's really the simplicity of it for this group. When I do my advanced physiology group, we get into more detail, as it were, about that. So you will see that in the animation just to make you aware of it. There's a lot of stuff that you see in a lot of these animations going forward that have a detail that's really not part of this particular course. So this brings us to what we saw the animation before, called excitation, contraction, coupling. Okay. How do we change signal A to signal B? How do we change electrical energy, if you want, okay, into mechanical energy? And so we saw that. Again, the action potential and the whole idea, if you recall previously what we discussed on Friday, the whole idea is if it reaches a sufficient value, which we all, and you're going to hear the term again and again, called threshold. Once it reaches this, quote, magical value of threshold, basically all it means is that that signal at the motor end plate has gotten to that next level. It's expanded to this giant array of voltage-gated sodium channels that are going to open and allow vast amounts of sodium to enter the cell, molecularly speaking. And that's going to start this, effectively, a chain reaction. So once the action potential is there and it propagates, which means it carries along the sarcolemma, which means the plasma cell membrane. And the way it gets deep inside, and you'll see it again when we do a quick look-see, and I'll sort of narrate through that excitation, contraction, coupling through those T tubules. This is test material coming up, not this test, but the next test. T tubules are part of the sarcolemma. Okay, and they're junction points where they create that triad with the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is really the smooth endoplasmic reticulum that has the calcium. The fact that I did it that way is to inform those of you here, certainly, and those of you who choose to listen eventually, that part of the sarcasm. Steelers lost, not happy. Defense sucks. But I digress. To understand that those are important questions. So we should be able to be gaining now some insight into what I think when I do things like that, or I make funny gestures, what I think are funny gestures. Those are really code, and all teachers do this. You just got to figure it out. That's the task of entry-level students, as many of you are. Keep going. So the action potential is propagated along the sarcolemma and down the T tubules. And again, now we're back to more of these stupid voltage-gated channels. You saw that in the animation. Basically, it's like flipping a switch. Best way to describe it, I think. and the calcium is released. It's already in the cell. And all we do when we release it is it's stored in there, ready to go and flood the interior. And it sets off this rather interesting reaction that we characterize as the start of contraction of the individual muscle fiber. And it's very quick. Again, electrical events, in this case, not only they precede chemical events, they precede mechanical events. And you got to bring that point home, because you're going to see that when you start to understand the heart. Who's ever going to do AP2 with you, when you start to understand what electrocardiograms are, and if I didn't tell you, I'll tell everybody, particularly if you're going into nursing. For instance, you've got to understand how to interpret those things and what they're meaning to you. That was the test. Maybe it's not the test anymore, but for the longest time, if you get a job at UPMC, you can't just work in intensive care. Did I mention all this stuff to you yet? It's like, I want to work in ER. You can't work in a critical care unit unless they certify you. They've got to vet you that you understand things, the medications, to vet you that you understand how to read electrocardiograms. So you have more classes to take. It ain't done here. It's like it used to be a week course, and every night there was a ton of homework. On the last day of the 5 days, you go there from 8 to 5, as my first wife did. And you have homework all night, and on the Friday, you take an exam on everything. And if you don't pass that, you can't work that unit. Doesn't mean you can't work, you just can't work that unit. You'll be on the floor if you work. Nothing wrong with a med surg floor or a peds floor. Got it? That's why we're doing this stuff. Oh, Lord help me. Moving on. So here it is a sequence of events which leads to the transmission of the action potential along the sarcolemma. Here it is, individual spot. Here's that neat little motor end plate on this particular aspect of that particular fiber that's there. And you can see once it carries and picks up those voltage-gated sodium and then potassium channels, is going to whisk its way across. Here is the start of T-tubule, that's sort of that, whatever color that is, not blue. And then you can see the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which appears to be more or less, to my way of looking at it, blue. And so you can see the way it looks. Here they're showing you that membrane aspect. And so this is the way they're depicting it. And here we see it close up. What's going on? There are those voltage-gated sensors that are there. We're going to go over that again. And then effectively this more or less creates the triad. Okay, for you, I'm not going to show you a picture and say identify this. It's going to say what does a triad consist of? It basically consists of two terminal cisternae on either side of a transverse tubule. That's all. And what it's going to lead to is this: as the calcium is released and floods, here it's going to effectively, as you might remember, alter those troponin plugs. We're going to see the animation that really demonstrates this subsequently. That allows, and I won't do it again, that allows the neat little tropomyosin to slide away and expose those heads. They're infinitely close, extraordinary to each other. And look at the reaction that's going to be here. You're going to see it attach and pull together. And that's what they call the power stroke or pivot. Whenever the cross bridge is forming, and you can see what they're trying to demonstrate is going to be pulled more to that midline of said cell. We'll look at this briefly, even though we saw it again. But you listen to it again to reinforce it. Hopefully she's talking.
Typically, a single motor neuron arising in the brain or spinal cord conducts action potentials that travel to hundreds of skeletal muscle fibers within a muscle. The sequence of events that converts action potentials in a muscle fiber to a contraction is known as excitation-contraction coupling. If we look at a single muscle fiber, we see that an action potential travels across the entire sarcolemma.
Great view of T-tubules.
And is rapidly conducted into the interior of the muscle fiber by structures called transverse tubules.
These are each fibrils.
T-tubules are regularly spaced enfoldings of the sarcolemma that branch extensively throughout the muscle fiber. At numerous junctions, the T-tubules make contact with a calcium-storing membranous network known as a sarcoplasmic reticulum, or SR. Where it abuts the T tubule, the SR forms sac-like bulges called terminal cisternae. One portion of a T tubule plus two adjacent terminal cisternae is known as a triad. The membranes of the T tubule and terminal cisternae are linked by a series of proteins that control calcium release. As an action potential travels down the T tubule, it causes a voltage-sensitive protein to change shape. This shape change opens a calcium release channel in the SR, allowing calcium ions to flood the sarcoplasm. This rapid influx of calcium triggers a contraction of the skeletal muscle fiber. Thus, calcium ions are responsible for the coupling of excitation to the contraction of skeletal muscle fibers.
Okay, gotcha. So just don't let this be confusing. It says at low intracellular calcium. It's low because the calcium is stored inside that sarcoplasmic reticulum. It's not flowing through the cell. I know students find that a little confusing. At that point, the tropomyosin threads, a thread-like protein, are covering those active sites on the actin. The heads can't attach, the fiber remains relaxed. Okay, and then voltage sensitive or voltage gated proteins in the T tubules change shape, and the sarcoplasmic reticulum then releases, because the opening is there, the calcium to flood inside to the cytoplasm or cytosol. And so what happens then, it's high or higher intracellular calcium concentrations. The calcium attaches to the troponin, again, the plug, the push pin, whatever, thumbtack, doesn't matter, double sticky tape, and the troponin changes shape and moves tropomyosin away from those binding sites on the actin. The heads are then allowed to bind, and they will do so immediately. And as long as they're exposed and there's ample energy and ample calcium, they will continue to do that, forming a cross bridge. The cycling, and I think you'll see that a little bit in this animation is coming up, because it said sarcomere to shorten and the muscle to contract. What happens when they say when nervous stimulation ceases, when there's no more firing and creating of an action potential at that neuromuscular junction or those neuromuscular junctions, effectively, energy is then needed not only to relax the muscle, as you will see shortly, but to pump the calcium back in. It's a very energy dependent process. It's almost like for us to move a muscle requires not only the action for the impetus for the nerve to tell the muscle move, but now we have an additional input of energy to pump the calcium back in and reset the muscle for the next time. Again, you're going to see muscles are ready to go at all times, and that's really important coming forward. So this is what we're going to look at, this cross bridge cycle. So now the calcium is flooded in. Now with the calcium flooded in, the tropomyosin threads basically are allowed to move because the calcium is attached to the troponin. Again, remember the sequence of events. Calcium attaches to the troponin changes shape, the tropomyosin is allowed to move, and expose those active sites to one another. Okay, so the cross bridge forms between, when they say a high energy myosin head, that's just code for precocked. It's ready to fire. Okay, and attaches, power stroke, pivot, whatever you want to call it, pulls those thin filaments, the actin filaments, toward the midline. Okay. Additional ATP is then required to attach to the myosin head to cause it to detach and recock itself. Basically, those are the steps that you'll see for the power stroke, because it's ready for the next cycle. That's what happens here. Once those heads are exposed, the stroke is automatic. So they're showing it to you. It's hard to see these illustrations, I think. But when we get to exposure, you're going to see it basically fires that way, pulling toward the midline. You can see it here. Now we require the input of additional ATP to detach it, and then finally to reset the head. You're going to see the animation will talk about hydrolyzing the ATP etc., etc. We don't, it just is sufficient for your purposes to know that the ATP causes this to detach. Voila. Hard one.
The contraction of a skeletal muscle generates the force necessary to move the skeleton. A contraction is triggered by a series of molecular events known as the cross-bridge cycle. In a skeletal muscle fiber, the functional unit of contraction is called the sarcomere. A sarcomere shortens when myosin heads and thick myofilaments form cross bridges with actin molecules and thin myofilaments.
See the end point there.
The formation of a cross bridge is initiated when calcium ions, released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, bind to troponin. This binding causes troponin to change shape. Tropomyosin moves away from the myosin binding sites on actin, allowing the myosin head to bind actin and form a cross bridge. Also note that the myosin head must be activated before a cross bridge cycle can begin. This occurs when ATP binds to the myosin head and is hydrolyzed to ADP and inorganic phosphate. The energy liberated from the hydrolysis of ATP activates the myosin head, forcing it into the cocked position. A cross-bridge cycle may be divided into 4 steps. Step 1. Cross-bridge formation. The activated myosin head binds to actin, forming a cross bridge. Inorganic phosphate is released, and the bond between myosin and actin becomes stronger. Step 2. The power stroke. ADP is released, and the activated myosin head pivots, sliding the thin myofilament toward the center of the sarcomere. Step 3. Cross-bridge detachment. When another ATP binds to the myosin head, the link between the myosin head and actin weakens, and the myosin head detaches. Step 4. Reactivation of the myosin head. ATP is hydrolyzed to ADP and inorganic phosphate. The energy released during hydrolysis reactivates the myosin head, returning it to the cocked position.
Now
As long as the
look at
binding
this.
sites on actin remain exposed, the cross-bridge cycle will repeat. And as the cycle repeats, the thin myofilaments are pulled toward each other and the sarcomere shortens. This shortening causes the whole muscle to contract. Cross-bridge cycling ends when calcium ions are actively transported back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Troponin returns to its original shape, allowing tropomyosin to glide over and cover the myosin binding site on actin.
See, there's a lot of complexity with regard to this, and I don't want you to necessarily feel like we're getting to this nonsense here. It's sensible to really the separation of the ATP into ADP and inorganic phosphate and making the bond stronger. Just know that the ATP is necessary to recock the head. Okay, so it's ready to go. Okay, so you're going to see that, and in order, once the muscle is fired, we need ATP to basically cause the separation to recock it. Like I said, the advanced phys students, they go into all this chapter and verse stuff. It's there. I mean, that's the distinction with it's the level of detail. And you always hear the old expression, the devil's in the details. That's very true in academics. I teach the same stuff to a lot of different classes over the years. It's all a matter of degree, okay, of what detail there is, and the complexity of how you ask questions about it in a testing format. That's really what it is. So here's this cross-bridge cycle. And so as we look at this cycle, initially the troponin It's holding those tropomyosin. It's really an interrelationship between the proteins. It's just easier if you think of it, it's just holding it there. And it's covering those binding sites that you can see. And what happens when the calcium floods the area, it releases, it exposes the binding sites. The head's already cocked because ATP has been put on it. The fact that it's separated into its components, don't worry about it. And then voila, they make contact, and effectively they call it pivoting, firing, ratcheting, whatever. Boom, it pulls it toward the midline. At that point, and that process will continue as long as there's calcium available. When there's calcium available, as long as it's constant, as long as the signal is going from the nerve to the muscle, saying, the acetylcholine's coming out and saying, keep releasing more calcium. Now, at that point, when we want to relax, we have to basically bring additional ATP to the party, and it will recock the head. That's what they're trying to show you. And I think the neat part about this is the way that they express it. Cross bridges form when the active sites are exposed to one another very rapidly, and the power stroke ensues. It just happens right away because it's preloaded with energy. And then we detach it by adding more energy to it. And then, as you can see, that makes it ready to go for the next one. And I love this part because what it tries to demonstrate is a continuous process from moving a muscle a little bit to moving it a lot. And that's where that offset thing that I talked about that might not have been as visible before, but one attaches, something else stays attached to it because the spring-loaded nature of that elastin would send it right back to the starting point. It doesn't happen. That's the beauty of the design. There. And you can see the accumulation, and you can almost see the end point as it comes close to the other. That's the physiological limit of shortening. So it can't shorten anymore, and if you just add this along, then you get what you get. That's the whole ball game there. It's a fascinating bit of cycling. And so here's the part toward the very end of this particular PowerPoint sequence to explain a very interesting phenomenon that has extraordinarily significant forensic value called rigor mortis, stiffening upon death. Why we sometimes will call a dead individual, though it's very inappropriate, stiff. Okay? Because they stiffen. They don't stiffen right away. Understand those muscles are ready to go. Doesn't matter. Okay. What happens when somebody dies? Effectively, as the process of deterioration begins, the sarcoplasmic reticulum begins to effectively lose its integrity, and the calcium exits. It floods the interior. And we know this is going to happen X amount of time after. It's based on ambient temperature, other types of conditions. That's where it's so useful in finding time of death. Is there. So forensic specialists, coroners, what they'll do is they'll look at a lot of different things. One of the things they look at is they'll know the outside temperature, the temperature during that period of time, and is rigor still present or has rigor left? Because you'll be able to tell. And what happens, that it's going to stay stiff for a period of time. As you can see, it's going to peak about 12 hours. And after that, all of a sudden, it's going to start to relax. It has nothing to do, remember, there's no energy. To cause the muscles to relax, you have to have energy. Look, a dead person can't manufacture any more energy. It's not going to be released. It's because it's the nature of the process. What happens is the muscle itself begins to deteriorate and break down, like all proteins do. Okay, they begin to denature, and all of a sudden that's one of the interesting things about time of death. So if you're doing, for instance, when we would do cadaver dissections, which you don't do here, but typically a medical school will do it, or a large university will do it for undergraduate or graduate students, or university wants to think it's large, we'll get one. Effectively, what happens is, what do? We refrigerate it because we want to stop the decomposition. So the whole thing, you ever wonder why a small university doesn't have cadavers or cadaveric parts? You have to have an elaborate system of refrigeration for storage. There's a lot of protocols to go through. Somebody or some family have their loved one has donated their remains for science. There's a whole process. You have to go through a funeral process and It's very, very elaborate. Because one of my first job interviews, I came in second, was at Chatham when they were going to be acquiring the cadaver. I think somebody knew what the heck to do with the cadaver, which I did. But another, a very brilliant guy got the position. I wasn't upset about it. They hired me to teach micro after that, thankfully. But we digress. Moving on. So that's the idea why it works. It's not the only thing that does it. If you're wondering, a lot of times if you have an idea what the person ate when the person ate last, certain things stay in the stomach contents. That's useful for praying time of death. That's another thing. And if you're wondering how they know if a body is moved, it's called liver mortis, or the lividity pattern. And what happens if effectively if somebody's in bed, dies in their sleep, you're going to see discoloration on their back because the blood vessels are going to basically give it up, and blood's going to extravasate or move out, and it's going to settle and discolor the back, the buttocks, etc. And if you see that and somebody's on their tummy, somebody moved the body, or the other way around, doesn't it? So it's not. People are aware of these things, but that's one of the things. I have an inordinate, a weird attraction to British crime shows. Our British friends love crime shows, and I'm all in. So I have a lot of that stuff that's there. So here it is. Peak rigidity, 12 hours. I'm not going to ask you about this. The most part you have to know is why rigor mortis occurs. It occurs because the energy's there, already loaded in the heads. Basically, the calcium gets released when somebody dies shortly thereafter, depending on the condition, and boom, that causes the muscles to fire. It becomes rigid, and then eventually it's going to deteriorate and let loose. So the cross bridge formation, so calcium cannot be pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So the myosin stays bound, causing the constant state of contraction until the proteins themselves denature. And then the stiff is no longer stiff. Voila. That is all this excitation contraction coupling. Let's hear it. I'm trying to do these lectures, and I realize you have an exam on Wednesday. I'm trying to basically limit the amount of topics if possible, particularly in a lecture environment, so you really get those more thorough. I'm trying to modify my teaching to help you folks that are there. So again, stand ready. I'm getting, and thankfully, and thank you very much for all you people who are coming and either coming in to ask questions or emailing questions. I appreciate it because it means, to not just to me, but to anybody else who's teaching, that indicates effort and interest, and that goes a long way. People know you're here. Of course, I'm telling the people who are here, and it's the people who are not here probably need to hear the message. You out in virtual land, I know you never listened to this, but do this. All right, I'm not in a happy mood. Steelers defense. I stayed up all night for that stuff. All right, moving on. Voila. We're not done yet. You're so happy to hear that. Now we understand a little bit more. Okay. Not a big deal. Understand when your body says, I want to move this muscle, it's not magic. The first thing the muscle has to do is to begin to have energy deposited in it. So in order to, we have to, the concept mechanically, and what little I know about physics, you have to develop tension. In other words, the muscle has to start to fire before it can shorten. And it can't shorten unless it can lift it up. Like I can lift this up fairly easily. I can't lift this up, but my muscle will still be firing. This is it. So all muscles start, okay, by what's called isometric. So the same principles apply to contraction of the single fiber, and this is where we're looking at the whole muscle. Contraction produces tension in the muscle. That's a force that exerts itself on a load or an object from a physics perspective. It may or may not shorten the muscle. I mean, isometrics, and question.
Sorry, could you send out those?
Oh, I didn't
slides?
send that out?
I don't.
Oh, WTF. God, actually, people laughed at my jokes. I really appreciate that. I'll do that right now. You got. Thanks for reminding me. I can. Oh God, my wife gives me such a hard time. You have no idea. She was just destroying me yesterday. That stuff I forgot to do. It's awful. I was in at the proverbial puppy chateau. That's an expression we use called in the doghouse. I think one night she may make me sleep in the crate. Big dogs. Okay, we are Blackboard. Oh, God, I got to sign in for this too. Amanda recount. Oh, messages, new message. All chorus members attach. So you need B and you're going to need C eventually, but we'll just do B for now. And hopefully I'll remember C right after this. Save. And through the magic of computers, you now have this. May I go back? Did you receive your technical information? I'm happy to provide that with you. Moving on. So, the way we start is isometrically. Iso is same, metric is length. We don't change the length, but the tension begins to increase until it exceeds whatever you're trying to move, the load. So obviously for something light, very easy. For something very heavy, pretty significant. Okay. And at that point, once it starts to overcome the load, effectively the tension, okay, the muscle shortens and the tension effectively remains the same as it does. So that's the difference between isometric and isotonic. Years ago, and maybe it's still done, I do know how the science, and many of you are interested in this, in physical therapy and training. Effectively, years ago, they used to teach us about isometrics. Basically, you could do a combination of isometrics, working with free weights, working with combinations. The nature of that has changed. Unbelievable. Since, our day and age when kids were in school, the different kinds of exercises. We went from stretching ballistically to stretching statically, and now it's more motion. Things like Pilates didn't exist. There's been so many nuances over time that have occurred. I mean, that's really exercise physiology. It's a very, very complicated area. A ton of students we have here are interested in it. Okay, so that's the difference between isometrics and isotonics that are there. So voila. So the same principle applies to both. The force and duration of the contraction vary with regard to the stimuli. This is my part of the picture. Okay, in response to stimuli of different frequencies and intensities. To understand this, and you're going to see this is a recurrent theme when we get into nerve and muscle. By and large, it's more about frequency than amplitude. And when you get to the nervous system, it's absolutely about frequency, not amplitude. When you hear my loud voice, that's because your brain is getting signals like that. When you hear my soft frequency represents amplitude. Similar, but not identical in muscles. So each muscle is served by at least one motor nerve, axons of up to hundreds of motor neurons. They branch into terminals. We saw that. The motor unit is basically the nerve and the muscle together. Not a big deal. I'm not going to ask much questions about a motor unit. So consists of one nerve and all the fibers. You can see from very little to quite a few. If you want to think of it this way, nerves facially, fingers, things when you do delicate or intricate things. okay, would involve small fiber numbers. Major big power muscles that you're moving, no, we want to move the whole thing. When I'm going to try my quarter of an inch vertical leap to try to get a rebound, which I can't, and certainly not now. I need a step ladder to get it done. We're sorry we built our kitchen cabinets up to the ceiling. We can't get there. Muscle fibers from a motor unit are spread throughout, so stimulation of a single motor unit, only a weak contraction. So you have, the more we call it recruiting them, and you're going to see this demonstrated. So here you are. Here's a motor nerve coming from the spinal cord. You might remember this is a ventral or anterior horn. Ventral is the appropriate terminology. We use dorsal and ventral. The horns are the gray matter. Voila, through that portion in the nerve, and it supplies those different areas. So you have different motor units, one here, one there, etc., etc. And this is what I meant when you said there's an illustration that kind of shows you can see those like little, almost like little feet, those axon terminals, how they sit on top of all these different muscle fibers that are there. And so this is stuff that we do in the laboratory. Okay, something, and it depends on the field that you're going into. So people going into physical therapy, these are the people who used to do these tests for us when I would order them. It's called electrophysiology. We would have them do muscle testing. You were trying to see if there was a nerve that was blocked, okay, or if there was a nerve that was damaged, or if it was a muscle problem, and you could tell that by looking at this. Basically, and it's something I can do in the lab with the technology we have. We do with our advanced students. You can put little sensors on and simulate this. It's external, so it's what we call non-invasive, the way we do it now. Years ago, they put a needle, a sterile needle, into a thumb, someplace on your foot, and they'd have a nerve stimulator. And people, my patients used to say back in the day, oh, I don't want to have the needle test. Because that was the way we saw if somebody had carpal tunnel, if somebody had a sciatic and they had a back surgery. Now we can do it a little more non-invasively with a degree of technology. And understand the word invasive is significant. Invasive means, I mean, you're invading. You're sticking a needle, you're sticking something in there. That means the potential of infection increases significantly. So muscle twitch, the simplest contraction. We only do this in the lab. Quickly and then relaxes. This is called a myogram. The term that you might see going forward is EMG, electronic myogram, or electromyographic things. And tracing is just the way we do it. Now the computer makes it easier for you to see. Effectively, they're going to simulate it. Understand that there's a nerve sending a chemical message to the muscle. The rate determining step, if you're familiar with chemistry, the step that's going to tell you how fast this reaction occurs is how quick that chemical gets across the synapse. That's what determines how fast a muscle can work. Okay, so we call this the latent period. So just the fact that I stimulated something, there's always going to be a little delay, even if we're talking about milliseconds or even smaller microseconds, for that to go across the muscle. The analogy is this. I'm sure you talk to people, we all do. Pick up your phone, you're talking to somebody in California. That's electrical, super fast. I mean, understand, from here, was it 2,000, 2,500 miles away? The speed of the electrics of sound do this. For us to get there, even flying in a jet's going to take us 4 or 5 hours. That's the distinction. Okay, electrically, we can do you have to understand that that's the rate determining step that's involved there. So electrically, we can do it almost instantaneously. Oh heck, my son and 2 daughter-in-law and 2 grandchildren are going to be in Bahrain for 2 years. I'm not going there on vacation. It's a long way. So that we'll talk to each other in real time, I'm sure. That's the distinction. So that latent period is really this delay between your mind saying something and me moving that. It's almost instantaneous to us, but it's not the same as an electrical signal. And so then there's contraction and then there's relaxation. Cross bridges form, tension increases, calcium basically pumped back into sarcoplasmic reticulum, and the tension declines. The muscle contracts faster than it relaxes. The pumping takes, remember, those heads are preloaded. So voila. This is, if we take a simple single stimulus. Okay, that's called a twitch. We do this in the laboratory. So what happens, it's going to contract rapidly, it's going to relax more slowly. This is, we're talking about milliseconds here. This is, what is this? 2 or 3 thousandths of a second. Again, but that's the distinction between a pure electrical signal and a neuromuscular junction, which releases chemicals a la acetylcholine. It'll contract and fire rapidly, and then it'll take some more time comparatively to relax. So the differences in strength and duration of those twitches are due to differences in the muscle, metabolic property, enzymes. Again, nothing moves more rapidly than your eyes. In lab, you did all those extraocular muscles, right? Did you do all those? Lateral rectus, superior oblique, love that. Did he teach you LR6 SO43? That's the little formula you never get the question wrong. You know, sorry. You should have asked me. I would have helped you. Okay? Eye muscle contractions are rapid. I could be looking to the sky for guidance, the Steelers last night. Whereas larger fleshy muscles, power muscles in the calf, more slowly and hold it long. One's particularly, you have muscles that are powerful, you have muscles that are postural, that are there. And here, this is a perfect example. Lateral rectus, boom. How fast you take it to look to the side? Right away. The gastrocnemius, your calf is made up of 3 muscles that go into the Achilles tendon. You have the 2 heads of the gastrocnemius, that counts as 2. And you have the soleus, which is deeper to it. They all come together and sort of twirl and form the Achilles tendon and inserts into the calcaneus. So aforementioned, going up for a rebound, gastrocnemius, those are your power muscles, your jumping muscles. The soleus are postural. And that's the difference. Fast, boom, but powerful because they're large. This is much slower because it's designed to fire almost continuously with subtle amounts of relaxation. Postural muscles are like that. That's the distinction. It's very, very elegantly chosen, these kinds of muscles. That's why you get a lot from this. They're there. So it explains why we talked about myasthenia gravis. Muscles that we use frequently tire more rapidly if there's a problem. If there's some kind of metabolic, autoimmune, or whatever problem there is. And so and we test those, we test different muscles to determine those things. So the normal muscle contraction is smooth and varies. The twitch is something we do in the lab, okay? But not a normal muscle. And so we are able to, what many of you will be trained to do when you're doing a physical assessment is you grade muscles. Muscles are inherently strong. You should be able to move your muscle against resistance. I can't push my hands against your hands and stop you from pushing mine away. Just like that. I can put my hands there, you're going to be able to open your mouth. Just the way it is. We grade them typically, I don't know if it's changed today, it was 0 to 6. Against resistance, against gravity, blah, 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 blah. I forget all those things. You can look them up. That's what everybody else does. And we grade those responses. That's to understand how we categorize that. If someone's had an injury for rehabilitation, we do it at, right after we start the rehabilitation and see if we get a certain amount of improvement. Typically, when someone hurts a muscle tears, something like that, injury, surgery, you're going to lose at least a grade. But for most of us, it doesn't matter. For most of us, unless you're a really high output athlete and playing at a very high level, interscholastically, serious amateur, that type of stuff, isn't that useful. Okay? But over time, those are the things that change all of these things. So again, that's something that they will talk about depending on your courses, if you're going into physical aspects of medicine, physical therapy, occupational therapy. I'm just wanting, for me, this is contextual material. I'm not going to ask you about it. What we'll get to on next time we meet, which will be the Friday because the test is Wednesday, we're going to talk about what happens when we change the frequency or change the strength, and you're going to see how important a role frequency plays. This was just introductory. Thank you, and see everybody Wednesday.